This is the new 2023 Mac Mini, and for $600, it might just be one of the best deals to come from Apple in recent memory. Let's talk about it. Hello and welcome to Denki channel. My name is Ken. The brand new Mac Mini came as a bit of a surprise in the news cycle. We all knew an update was inevitable. After all, the outgoing M1 Mac Mini came out back in 2020, and they were selling the 2018 Intel Mac Mini at the same time. But Apple went and announced this thing without a proper keynote. The launch might have been relatively quiet and low-key, though it's not much of an indicator for what Apple's offering. In fact, I think it's some of the best value out of any product they sell today. The 2023 Mac Mini includes Apple's newest M2 chip with an 8-core CPU that's split between 4 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores, as well as a 10-core GPU, 8 gigs of RAM, and a 256 gig SSD. All of this, again, for $600 here in the US, which is $100 less than what they were selling the M1 Mac Mini for. Though, as always, you'll have to factor in a mouse, keyboard, and monitor if you don't already have those. The real-world story with Apple Silicon is truly made whole with macOS. Obviously, whether or not it's your cup of tea is another can of worms. But software optimization is key to the buttery smooth performance this M2 offers.
You can just keep worms away from my tea, I'd appreciate it.
It delivers plenty of power for productivity and general use, which is sure to last you for years. But where it comes in clutch is for content creation. The dedicated video encoding and decoding on M2 has made playback and render in Final Cut and DaVinci Resolve a breeze, which is especially useful if you churn out lots of content on the regular. In fact, I'm editing this entire video on the base model Mac Mini. Pretty good. Now, it isn't perfect. I get occasional stutters when I'm playing back footage with heavy color grading and effects, but the fact that I'm able to complete an entire Denki edit on this base model M2 Mac Mini is pretty cool. Just needs a little bit of patience, especially compared to more powerful machines like the one that I'm used to, my 14-inch M1 Max MacBook Pro. But really, the cherry on top is that the entire package is tiny and quiet. Like me.
Neither of those things are true.
It can seamlessly blend into your setup, and the small footprint can save you valuable desk space. I plan on making a Mac Mini setup video pretty soon, so if you're curious about how I set this one up, subscribe and click on the bell icon to get notified on when it goes live. If there are any things I'd change with this 2023 Mac Mini, one, I wish there were front-facing I/O for easy access like on the Mac Studio. On that note, while there are more ports on this thing than, say, a MacBook Air, 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports and 2 Type-A still does not feel like enough USB, especially if you're planning on using multiple displays or wired peripherals. Certainly nothing a USB-C hub can't fix if you're finding yourself in a bind, so not the end of the world. But the big compromise with the base model that's worth putting on your radar is with the RAM and storage. 8 gigs of unified RAM is fine on Apple Silicon for basic and mild workloads. However, it does restrict how much you can multitask between apps. For my standard YouTube content creator flow, bouncing between Final Cut, Photoshop, and multiple tabs in Safari can cause this base Mini to chug on occasion. And to make matters worse, this M2 Mac Mini with its 256 gig SSD is single NAND flash. This means slower SSD speeds than what the hardware is capable of. You see, when macOS detects that you're running low on available RAM, it essentially borrows from storage, or swaps, to do what it has to do to run optimally. But if you're running slower single NAND flash storage, this can affect how quickly swapping occurs, and therefore affect overall system performance. If you're the type of person that's not good about managing your files and keeping a healthy amount of storage available, fill up your SSD to like 95% full or something crazy like that. You shouldn't.
Don't do that.
I'll tell you, 8 gigs of RAM in that scenario will seriously come back to bite you. Worse is that while Apple lets you spec things up, surprise, surprise, it's not cheap. Want 16 gigs of RAM or a 1 terabyte SSD? Those are $200 and $400 a pop respectively, and those are not user upgradable. You can go to Best Buy and buy a 1 terabyte Samsung T7 for $95. For my money, I'd prioritize upgrading to 16 gigs of RAM, which if we're talking about the base model, bumps up the total to $800, which in all fairness is still a good price point. I've been talking a lot about value as the crux for why I think people should buy the base Mac Mini, but so far it's been in a vacuum. So I did a little bit of research to see how it stacks up with other devices, and here's what I found. There's always people drawing conclusions to Windows devices in the comments, and there's a surprising amount you can buy in the $600 to $800 range that can maximize your dollar. Now, while I don't exactly have one here in the studio to say for sure, but on paper, a device like the Beelink SER6 with a Ryzen 7 6800H, 32 gigs of RAM, and 512 gigs of storage, also with an install of Windows 11 because that's important, a device like this can offer you more flexibility than what a Mac can give you. Go outside the mini form factor and the world opens up for you way more. There are laptops and custom builds for days with dedicated GPUs that offer decent gaming chops that the Mac Mini can't offer on sheer limitation of Mac OS. However, if you want to see how much you can game on a Mac in 2023, go check out the video we made on the Austin Evans channel where we run the gamut to answer this question that no one really asked. Austin.
I was curious. What can I say?
And curiosity killed the cat. However, what all of these Windows machines can't touch is the sheer power and optimization that comes with M2 for most of everything else. How much that matters versus how you feel about macOS overall really comes down to personal preference. The story gets a little more complicated when we're comparing the new Mac Mini to other Macs that Apple sells. Now, I'm not gonna go way into the weeds comparing everything in the lineup, but some takeaways I found while scanning the website: the base M2 Mac Mini with its 10-core GPU is a higher spec system than the base M2 MacBook Air. You have to add $100 to the Air's price to get an even match, making it over double the cost of the Mac Mini. While it's not an apples to apples comparison, poor choice of words, I don't think the Air is double the computer the Mini is. And also, this Mac Mini happens to have a fan in it, which helps with cooling. Additionally, for reference, we also got the M2 Pro Mac Mini in the studio to test out as well. While that system is very interesting in its own right, it's a complicated value proposition. Start adding Apple's ludicrously expensive options and upgrades to the $1,300 top trim, and you're practically spitting distance to the Mac Studio at $2,000. 10 gig Ethernet might be worth a thought at only $100, especially if you're planning on integrating this into a proper networking setup, maybe as a server. However, with a negligible difference in power between the M2 Pro in the Mac Mini and the M1 Max in the Mac Studio, 32 gigs of RAM, 10 gig Ethernet built in, and creature comforts like better cooling and front-facing I/O, the Studio is objectively better than an upgraded Mini in most conceivable ways. The $1,300 M2 Pro Mac Mini really is the way to go. Keep it the way Apple intended. I do think the addition of HDMI 2.1 on the M2 Pro Mac Mini is cool, and I can't wait to hook it up to a high refresh rate OLED like for a certain video that I said I was working on earlier. Stay tuned. And one last point, which is something that Luke Miani pointed out on Twitter: the only other serious alternative to the M2 base Mac Mini that I think is worth considering is the last generation M1 Mac Mini. As you can imagine, with the new models hitting stores over the coming days, prices on the M1 are bound to drop. Especially if you're okay buying used or refurbished, you're currently looking in the $400 range, which is more than adequate power for a computer at that price. Mind you, we're barely into the new generation of Mac Mini, so I think these prices have more room to drop. If the M2 Mac Mini can see a $100 discount on release day, then I think there's some value to be had if you're patient. But let me know, what do you think about the new Mac Mini? Drop me a line below, I'd love to hear what you have to say. Also, if you like content like this, hit that thumbs up button, as well as the subscribe button and the bell icon to get notified on when new videos go live.